Welcome to Canada's podcast. So Jeff and Paul, welcome to Canada's podcast. I'm really been looking forward to this session. But before we get rolling, we'll start with you, Jeff. Why don't you just give us a little bit about who you are, who Jeff Sear is, what you do at Raven, what your objectives are and things like that. Then Paul, maybe you can follow on from that. Okay.
Sure. Thanks, Philip, for inviting us onto the podcast first and foremost. And it's good to do a podcast with Paul together because we don't get that opportunity too much. So as you mentioned, my name is Jeff Sear. My traditional name is Kinu Inene, which means Eagle Man Leading. I hail from the traditional Métis territory of the Whitehorse Plains area in Southern Manitoba, which is the buffalo hunt staging ground. I now live, work, and sometimes play an unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. I am my mother is Vivian Sear and my father is Brian Sear, both back in our traditional territory. And my wife is Nicole McDonald, and I have 5 children. They're pretty much all adult children at this stage, going to university. And I am the managing partner for Raven Indigenous Capital Partners. So there's that sort of quick bio. And I know Paul will do his, and I will say very brief.
What's your focus, Jeff, within Raven Indigenous Capital Partners?
Well, I guess my focus is on, raising and deploying Indigenous-led capital into Indigenous social enterprises for the benefit of our people to build a robust and resilient Indigenous economy. And that, in my role in particular, like Paul and others, but I'm focused on sort of the broad strategic interplay of capital in the space, creating value with these companies, really doing something different with money than what's traditionally been extractive on and with our people. And venture capital is traditionally extractive too, since its emergence, in the late 70s and early 80s in Silicon Valley. So that's the role that I play. I also do a lot of work on social finance instruments, which we call community-driven outcomes contracts, and trying to lead some work around type 2 diabetes reduction in Indigenous communities through a social finance mechanism.
Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and like Jeff, I wanted to say and communicate our appreciation for the invite. So I'm Paul Lacerte. My traditional name is Gilam Gilo. I'm born and raised in my home territory, which is the Carrier territory in north central British Columbia, and my First Nation community is called Notle Waten, and I'm a member of the Caribou clan there, which holds great significance for me as we are a matrilineal society, and we're a potlatch culture, and so. As I said, born and raised in my territory. I now live and work here in the traditional lands of the Lekwungen speaking people, which is the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, otherwise known as Victoria, British Columbia. I'm a managing partner together with Jeff for Raven Indigenous Capital Partners. We are an Indigenous owned and Indigenous led firm, I guess, and we're known as a financial intermediary, and why that's important, I think, for Jeff and I, and for our other partner Stephen Nairn, is that we're living in the space in between. We're living and working in the space in between, where the capital lives and where Indigenous people live, and as Jeff said, Philip, our the purpose of our work and the intention of our work is to facilitate the flow of capital towards solutions in the Indigenous space as defined by our people. And so being the first of our kind in Canada as an Indigenous owned financial intermediary and raising the first ever Indigenous owned impact fund in Canada. And we think, at least in North America, if not in the world. It was important for us right away to define success through an Indigenous cultural lens, and through the eyes of real Indigenous people in real Indigenous communities in Canada, and that has to a certain extent been about flipping the paradigm, both in what Jeff was saying around social finance arrangements, and also just in a traditional investing space, shifting the paradigm so that it's really Indigenous people that are in the driver's seat as opposed to government or investors. And that's really the trajectory that we're on.
Just a little, clarification for those that aren't familiar with Indigenous culture is why choose the name Raven? If one of you can jump in on that, because people don't know this, the symbolism in terms of Indigenous side of it, and I'd like people to be clear on that.
Yeah, I think I'll ask my brother to share a little bit about it as well, but I would say for two reasons from my perspective. One is that in many Indigenous cultures in Canada, we have over 50 Indigenous languages in Canada, and many of them are as different from each other as French and German are from each other. And of course, inside each of those Indigenous cultures, you have resident epistemologies and teachings. And one of the things that we wanted to find was something that is held to be sacred, an identity that is held to be sacred in Indigenous cultures all over, Canada, North America. We call that Turtle Island. And the Raven is really held to be something that is sacred in Indigenous cultures all over Turtle Island. And this is a coast to coast to coast, approach. And so we wanted, to land on something that had sacredness and was recognized across Canada. And the second is the spirit of innovation, that folks often see a bit playful, with the Raven. Some people even say trickster, but at the core of it is really a recognition of the power of being generative and being innovative, is really the spirit that and the recognition that Indigenous cultures all over Turtle Island hold, when they think about and talk about the Ravens. So I don't know, Jeff, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just Paul did a great job there. It's one small thing is, Raven's a central figure in a lot of creation stories too, across Turtle Island, and that comes to symbolize sort of transformation and rebirth out of that. And the Raven is the symbol of that, and it usually plays a key role in that. And I think it's one of the things that attracted us to Raven as a name, representing what we are trying to do as a firm.
So I'm going to, you're entrepreneurs within this framework. What's been the biggest single challenge in the journey so far of Raven Capital Partners? Paul, you go first. Whichever.
What has been our single biggest challenge so far?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say I really appreciate that question, Philip, and I would say it's been a challenge and an opportunity for us, which is to enter into and participate in a system and a set of relationships that have like generational inertia around risk and return. That notwithstanding that we are working with folks in an ecosystem that want to use their money for good. Okay, there's this desire in the impact investing space to use money for good. The systems that have been built around the way that discipline is seen and perceived in the context of capital has largely been about risk and return. And the responsibility that we have and the opportunity that we have is to shift that lens so that it's risk, return, and impact. And that in the context of impact, that we are able to grow a collective set of understandings and a collective set of values and priorities so that the impact that we're having makes sense for Indigenous people. We've largely been invisible, Philip, in the investing ecosystem, particularly in the venture capital ecosystem. Indigenous people have certainly not been positioned as investors.
Yeah,
and in large part, Indigenous people have really struggled to gain access to all forms of capital. And when we do gain access to capital, it is at terms, based on terms defined outside of our interests. And so there is an incredible amount of intergenerational structuring and inertia in reinforcing those systems. And I would say our biggest challenge, which could also be seen as an opportunity, is to reimagine those systems and those values in a way that is defined by our Indigenous worldview and works for Indigenous people. Otherwise, we're going to reinvent the capitalist systems that have landed Indigenous people in the situations that we find ourselves in.
I was thinking a bit about the reinvention. I'm going to throw this one at you, Jeff. Why is your approach, Raven's approach, good for Indigenous peoples? I understand it would be, but and good for investors. You know, how do you get that balance? Because I think a lot of people would sort of have that question.
Sure. Yeah. And this goes back to a lot of what Paul just said too, in terms of where the challenges are. So that this is a balancing act that we do on a daily basis within Raven. And it's the idea that you can do economics differently and that you can get good results, but you can actually layer inside that a set of values that follows Indigenous epistemology. Now, to make that real, I think I would, maybe put it as a somewhat of an example. We in the fund, the promise to investors is a sort of a 6 to 8, 7 to 9% IRR on the fund.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not typical of venture capital by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, most funds, would shoot for expectations somewhere between 15 and 19% overall.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a responsibility to our people, which is why we're doing this. And if we are not as extractive of the value of those companies to hit those sorts of returns, then it allows us to make different decisions with entrepreneurs along the way. But how you structure deals, how you keep value, and I mean value of a company, but also value of people and value of that experience inside the hands of Indigenous people. So we're not trying to extract as much wealth from the companies. That means our approach going into it is different. So we structure different deal terms and term sheets as a result. This has been good, of course, for the Indigenous investees, but it's also good for the folks who invest in us because they get an example of how you can probably do economics differently. Why would that be important to them? Well, we wouldn't have maybe massive issues with climate change or extreme issues of income inequality if we started to think differently about the role that money plays and how it plays and how it can be used. I think it's an extremely important point is they benefited from as well, because what we have in society today, and it's worse during the pandemic than it ever has been, is a massively increasing gap between rich or poor. It largely falls into the hands of very, very rich people.
Yeah,
So it's a fairly critical way of working differently.
yeah. I was gonna ask you guys. What about your partners? I mean, it's it's Raven Capital Partners. One of the things I was curious about is, some you can be more public than others, but is there kind of a model partner that you've been at this for a little while now that you're finding, or is that a kind of dumbass thing kind of thing?
No, I mean we're look, we have 36 investors in the fund, and so we see those as relationships, Philip, and on the investor side, we have organizations and institutions that have invested here in Canada. We have some investors from the United States. We have some high net worth individuals who have invested, and what we hear consistently from those as investors is that they are looking for and have been looking for investable products in the reconciliation space. That folks have been looking for a balance of discipline in the way that we make investments and deploy capital, and a level of cultural integrity, like authenticity in the Indigenous space is hard to come by. A lot you get lots of rental approaches to relationships in the Indigenous space, and what we've actually screened for and been really grateful for is that, to the extent that you would see our investors as partners, that there is a genuine interest, to Jeff's exact point, on thinking about their return on investment differently, on thinking about blended returns as opposed to what you might see in a traditional VC environment, which is, just straight up aggressive returns because they're taking a bigger risk. And folks are increasingly on the investor side willing to hear about returns for Indigenous people in ways that might be really brand new for them. And so, to your question, the kind of partners that we are attracting as investors, as ecosystem partners, here in Canada, are genuinely curious. I think there is a genuine desire to and willingness to say that they don't really understand the Indigenous space, and that it can be easy to be scared of the Indigenous space because you don't want to make a mistake, you don't want to offend people, you don't want to step on a cultural landmine. And so they've been really warmly welcoming us as financial intermediaries. We almost play a translator function in helping to guide people that really want to lean into relationships with Indigenous people through the exchange of investment capital. We've been able to help to facilitate that. And I wanted to get Jeff to add on to this. I think this is an important question.
Just before you jump in, Jeff, I'm going to be one of those annoying hosts that kind of stops you.
Okay.
But, this is something we discussed, before. Is this part of the sort of decolonization kind of movement that I mean, I obviously have lots of Indigenous friends that I see happening. Are you trying to push this into the capital space kind of thing? Can you kind of answer it sort of more from that perspective, Jeff?
From the perspective of the desire to people to support decolonization?
Yeah.
I would probably flip your language around, Philip. I would say
that's okay. That's fine.
It's a desire to support reconciliation, as Paul said, because they're different concepts at play here. And, all credit goes to all the elders and all of our ancestors involved in the residential school movement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, because they really opened the door to a reconciliation movement, and lots of folks before us in that space. What Paul hit the nail on the head for is that I think the common everyday average Canadian and the common everyday average investor may be motivated to make investments in reconciliation and doesn't really know how to do that. There aren't really vehicles in the space. And so the Raven Fund 1, the Impact Fund 1, is really a vehicle in the space, the first of its kind, where folks can participate. And it motivated them towards that. The one thing I wanted to add to what Paul said before was, if I may, is that the nature of the type of investor that's come into Raven has shifted and evolved over time. When we were first starting out, this investor was a smaller cap, either a small foundation or high net worth individual in Canada. That's increased to very large foundations coming out of the US. And the reason is important. It's because there's a broad-based movement around, for lack of better words, inclusion and diversity in the finance space, and a recognition that things are topsy-turvy in that space, that all those big, and there's a lot more capital in the United States, all those funds are starting to look for how do we invest in Latinx and Black-led funds and organizations and Indigenous. Mm-hmm. And so, there's certainly some energy behind that in the ecosystem now.
So there's quite a number of BIPOC focused fund managers around. Either one of you can answer this. What kind of advice would you pass on to those in terms of not just Raven Capital, but emerging funds like yourself in terms of involvement?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is to every extent possible, stand your ground, for establish and stand by your values framework. That there is an expectation and it's almost a trap, Philip, in the investor world, that if deference to investors, be their institutional or high net worth, deference to their values framework, their approaches, their lexicon, equals an increase in their level of investment. And what we have found is that the extent to which you can take a risk and stand by your values, even if it feels uncomfortable or new, that investors will come around. And so for folks in the BIPOC space, I would say establish a values framework and stand your ground. And the second is very firmly, and this is probably the most important for me, is to very clearly define and measure what impact means to you in your context. And in the BIPOC space in particular, you have so many cultural drivers and variances around, not just around ethnicity, but around immigration and new Canadians. And a gender lens that is on top of a race-based lens, so that impact looks really different for a South Asian woman who is a first-generation Canadian than it does for an older white male who's been an investment manager for the last 25 years. And sometimes the understandings of impact are like miles apart from each other.
I definitely get that.
Underlying values around that. So I would say understand and measure impact in a way that makes sense for the intended beneficiaries of the work that you're undertaking.
Jeff, both of you really, I just wanted some examples, if you could give me. Are there any kind of entrepreneurial journeys underway that you can discuss that might sort of, be a good exemplar of really where you're trying to drive? There may not be. I don't know.
Sure. I think all of our founders and entrepreneurs that we invest in are amazing people, first of all. And they're the ones that kind of get me out of bed in the morning, get me excited to go to work, go to the computer and do the work. Who would I highlight? I would highlight Bobby Rosette from Virtual Gurus. Virtual Gurus is a two-sided marketplace talent as a service solution, but it's Bobby's story that's more interesting. And I would put it as she was in the oil patch as a LGBTQ woman who got laid off I think it was 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago now, with a downturn in the oil patch, and turned it around to build a company that basically provides virtual talent. We often think of it as virtual assistants, but they do so much more than what we'd consider an assistant, executive assistants, and that. And then really is digging deep into rural and remote communities to find the Indigenous talent pool and other talent pool and connect it across Canada with companies and then across the US. And it's a smart, savvy, hockey stick growing business that also has a deep moral core about how to support Indigenous communities, how to support Indigenous people, builds an academy internally to help, upskill folks in that sort of way. So much so that even I went out and got a virtual assistant to help out. So yeah, it's a great entrepreneurial storyline of really sort of tenacity.
Paul, I was looking at the website and can you explain? The Solutions Lab was pretty interesting. Can you explain that a little bit more, Paul? I think I was really interested, so I wanted to kind of highlight that in the conversation.
Yeah, as Jeff was saying, we're raising and deploying capital under the fund, and we're also building solutions in the social finance space. And it's really been largely through Jeff's leadership. So I really want to acknowledge the thought leadership of our firm, in very often expressed through design work that Jeff has done. And he's recently become an Ashoka Fellow, and tapping into a broader brain pool of folks that really want to help us build I think the level of rigor that we need in this space. And so to answer your question, Philip, the Solutions Lab is unique because it is a co-creation environment. What makes it an innovation lab in large part is the fact that there are a number of unusual suspects around the same table. In this case, we have First Nations community representatives from the Government of Canada, the Government of Manitoba. We have investors around the table, and we have subject matter experts. And the case that we're working on right now is focusing on addressing the scourge of type 2 diabetes in Northern First Nations communities, where issues like food security, are pretty acute.
Yeah.
And as you've seen in the media, and your listeners will have seen in the media, the effect of boil water advisories, and combined, you have Indigenous communities that are really struggling from a health perspective. So the Innovation Lab brings all of those disparate players together, and we literally put Indigenous medicine in the middle. We actually, Jeff and I both open our bundles, our personal medicine bundles, and we have those medicines in the middle. And what it represents is that the well-being of Indigenous people, as defined by Indigenous people, is in the middle of our work. And then we collectively put our minds together in that container, in the Indigenous mindset container, and co-create an environment where private investors can put capital, where Indigenous communities can put that capital to work on solutions that they have defined that work for them. And that when we prove that those solutions work and that there is a net savings to government, that government pays those investors back plus a return and still realizes a long-term substantive savings for services that they would have otherwise had to pay for. That is really about also the ongoing generational suffering of our people. So the secret to the success of why it's an innovation lab is that it's driven by our communities, it's for our communities, but those solutions are co-created with a whole bunch of stakeholders that have knowledge and interest in an improved quality of life for an Indigenous people, and for investors, a healthy return on their investment. So I don't know, Jeff, if I've accurately reflected on our journey in that space, but it's important.
Yeah, no, Bud did a brilliant job. I'll just talk about a couple more elements of that, Philip. That through all that co-creation work and coming out with an outcomes financing method, what we're talking about here is, 4 communities in Northern Manitoba and 2 in Prince Edward Island. But what this is really about is scale. Mm-hmm. Type 2 diabetes is an epidemic in its own right. It's a crisis. It's growing.
Yes.
Ever younger people and ever more of them. And the cost to the healthcare system, which you and I and everybody as taxpayers puts our money into, is enormous. It's so enormous it dwarfs any of the previous thinking in this space around clean energy or other ways to use outcomes financing. It saves government hundreds of millions of dollars. Like it's that extreme. More importantly, it does it by putting the community's priorities and needs at the front and center of it, and empowering the community to make, the changes that come along with these interventions, giving it the stickiness that it needs to last over time, which is really the key. What may happen, the one last thing I'll add is, what I expect will happen is, maybe be de facto creating a different sort of financial marketplace for outcomes financing as well at the same time. Mm-hmm. On top of what you have as either venture capital or private equity or mergers and acquisitions, all of a sudden you may have a social finance marketplace for outcomes purchasing, which is an interesting financial innovation in its own right.
Okay. I think I love some of the things you've been saying, but I'm going to ask you one big question at the end that each of you can do is, and both answer it. Jeff, we'll start with you. What's the biggest challenge for Raven Capital in the next 5 years? I mean, I love the progression. I love what I'm here. I love the progression. It's terrific. It's really exciting. So what's the biggest challenge that you see, Jeff, for Raven in the next 5 years?
I mean, it's interesting. So we're at the early stage of our journey as Raven, the way I think about it. We've raised capital, and now I think we're in the tough part of deploying that capital and building sort of Indigenous value, Indigenous wealth with the companies. Mm-hmm. I think sticking true to our purpose, being focused, executing really clearly about that, and then, of course, the all-important demonstrating the impact on our people. Mm-hmm. That's a big challenge. I don't want to undersell exactly how big of a challenge that is to do. All venture capital work is tough, and we've taken a path for the upliftment of our communities that I think is tougher, but absolutely necessary. So I think the challenge is just, completing our journey, going down the execution pathway. We've been doing okay during the pandemic. All the businesses have been doing actually well. So that's a healthy sign that we've got a resilient set of businesses underneath us. Yeah. And we're going to go out and get a few more. Mm-hmm. So anyways, I think the biggest challenge is just doing what we said we're going to do and keep going on our path and not getting distracted.
Paul, you want to dive in and sort of give your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. I think that our biggest challenge is going to be related to being the only game in town as an Indigenous VC deploying on an Indigenous Impact Fund, and falling into a trap where expectations, far exceed the size of our actual footprint. And so this is a little bit of a take on Jeff's comment, is that, there's so much romanticization about sort of Indigenous people and the potential in this space. And, we're still only at a $25 million fund. And so we're only going to be able to deploy a relatively small amount of capital. And I think the biggest challenge is that expectations in the ecosystem have been raised. And this is really a trap that people set for Indigenous people who are starting to have some level of success, is that you have to be a panacea, that it has to be medicine for all the ailments, and I think, as Jeff said, swimming in our lane, and having right-sized expectations and meeting those right-sized expectations, both in terms of Indigenous entrepreneurs in Canada that are looking for access to this kind of capital. This is pretty attractive capital. It's patient, it's culturally safe. We're trying to make it gender safe. And there's a ton of support that comes with the money that we're able to make available. And it's a small amount of money yet. So right-sizing expectations and then doing a really good job of meeting those expectations in a good way, I think is going to be our biggest challenge.
So, you're on a national entrepreneurs network here. Who do you feel should connect with you and access your expertise and funding? Is there a model, or is there, how would you respond to that? Because lots of people will view and listen to it.
I mean, I'll jump in, Paul. It's okay. I think the one group that I would suggest would connect with us are those sort of Indigenous entrepreneurs who have, interesting businesses in the space. As Paul said, we're really in the innovation space. We're looking for innovative enterprises to grow and build. Those enterprises need the sort of venture capital that we have. Other types of what often are called mainstream enterprises can access capital a slight bit easier, not totally, but a slight bit easier. And I would encourage them to reach out if they're looking for an equity investment. And that we'd entertain. We're still placing capital for another, can't remember what it is, 14 months, 12 months, 14 months?
About another year and a half, yeah.
Yeah. So, now's the time to reach out with your exciting business and let us know about it.
Okay. All right, Jeff, Paul, that was really, really interesting. I'm sure, as I said, we'll get a lot of listeners. Thanks for coming on and for answering everything so clearly. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Philip. Appreciate it.
Thank you.